Living Life Juicy, the podcast where we explore how we can be present and kind as we do great things. You can find the Living Life Juicy podcast on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform. You may also want to check out the Growing People podcast, where we post things about how people learn and grow and how communities are formed. You can find out more about the Into Wisdom group by going to intowisdomgroup.com. And I got to plug my book. A book just came out a couple of months ago called The Pottery Panda, and you can find out more about that at potterypanda.com. But we just got done talking with Lee Sheridan, who was we met each other at Farmers Insurance in the corporate world. He went out and bought a franchise, started his own business, actually became a serial entrepreneur. And our discussion, if you haven't seen it, the previous episode is just amazing if you're into thriving inside an organization or if you're an entrepreneur and starting organizations. Lee has some amazing insights. But I like to take some time and turn the tables a little bit and let Lee interview me. So we're going to go with 3 questions from Lee. So Lee, take it over.
All right. So you gave me close to 0 time to figure out what questions I was going to ask. So one thing I think is important to me is what is one of the biggest gaps that you see with leaders? Where do you see them struggling most?
That's a great question. And as I work with different people, I mean, there's different specifics, but ultimately it tends to be the urgency, the false sense of urgency to move forward. And the way they answer that is, if I need to move forward, I need to be better technically, when really, technically, they're really proficient. There might be small gaps in there, but ultimately, their technical capabilities and competencies are just strong. They're just not healthy. And the first thing they go to is, well, I need to learn more about my business. I need to learn more about accounting. I need to learn more about fill in the blank for the technical proficiencies, when really what most of us need is learning more about our self-awareness and self-management, learning more about how we make judgments and decisions, learning more about how we ourselves develop and how we can develop other people. Those to me are about being a healthy professional, not just a smart professional.
Now, you've obviously trained countless people. How do you evaluate an organization to identify where you need to start with regards to coaching or anything along those lines? What's your process to evaluate?
That's a great, because it is an approach. And what I learned while I was working at Farmers is very rarely is just coaching a solution or just organizational development a solution. It's a mix. So the first thing I want to know is, what is their purpose and mission? And does that align with their strategy and culture? Now, culture was interesting. Everybody's going toward, we need to adjust our culture. We need to change our culture. And culture is the most difficult thing to change. And ultimately, you don't change culture. You can't change culture. You change the systems that produce that culture. And that gets into the organizational piece. And so if you look at, all right, first of all, if you don't have a clear purpose and mission, then you're adrift. And all of your systems, all of the other strategies are happening on accident. So first of all, if you don't have a clearly articulated and useful purpose and mission, it's really hard to step forward. That's personally, individually, and as an organization. So that's my first step. Not everybody needs to redo their mission statement, all that. It's just that, is it clear and is it shared? And then we step in and we say, is there alignment between what your strategy currently is and your mission and purpose? If there's not alignment there, if you don't have a clear picture of what you want to become, then your strategy may be taking you in the wrong direction. And I'm not one of these people. I don't buy the phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast. You need both. If your culture and strategy aren't aligned, you're going down the wrong thing. And we talked about like a high turnover pass-through businesses where people go and they stay there for a little bit. That is a cultural piece that you can align your strategy to. But if your culture and strategy aren't aligned, then you're pulling away from things. So to me, the very first thing I do is find out about their purpose and mission, and then we can start talking about the coaching aspect of it, the advising and guiding aspect of it, and also the organizational development part of figuring out the strategies and the alignment. It's not about getting rid of silos, because that's what an organization is. It's how do you work, how do those silos communicate, and how do they manage the white space between them?
And that's great. And we have a mission statement, and so I think you have to start with the end and then work your way back, right? So when people think of you, what do you want them to think of? So we created a mission statement.
If you go back to what we did with the presidential leadership program, the very first thing we did wasn't look at where you were at. We looked at what do you want to become? And you picture success first, because if you start with where you're at, you're immediately imposing limitations. But if you start with where you want to be and then you go back to where you're at, now you can kind of assess the terrain between there and figure out a way to get to what you want to become.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. All right. You're a creative guy. You're a musician, you're an author. Where do you go to find creative inspiration? What's the place, whether it be in the room in your house or stage, a park? Where do you go to get that inspiration?
I think one of the most important thing I've done is start this podcast and talking with interesting people like you. That it doesn't make me replicate what you offer. It spurs me forward. And I think the same thing happens with not only reading good business books, but reading crap novels. Not just listening to, like, one of my favorite work stations is Keith Jarrett Radio on Pandora. He was a improv jazz person, but just all that style of music gets me thinking. But so does our friend Jimmy Buffett. I think that there's not one place. I try and get down to one of my office annexes, which is the beach down here, and I keep a table in the back of my truck, and I pull a chair out, put the table out, and I do some work there. I think more important than where is creating margins in your life. Just like there's margins in a book, so the words don't run off the end of the page. Margins in a book are intended to be a space where you interact with it. That's a margin, and all the white space on a page is for the reader. And just like creating margins in your life where there's space, first of all, things don't always go as planned. So when you have margins, you can expand into the margins when things don't go as planned. And when they do go as planned, you have those margins for you. And that's where you find not only the creativity, but the rest that's needed to do something about the creativity. Because there's creative people who never land the plane. They have all these great ideas, but it never comes to anything that touches the world. And there's really practical people who don't take advantage of that margin or that space to come up with new things. So to me, it's, if you're asking for a place, the creativity and the innovation happens in the margins.
I love that analogy.
Yeah. Well, that's 3 questions, Lee. I love that. Number one, I learn as much from your answers to my questions as your questions tell a lot about you. So I appreciate the questions that you ask, and I appreciate you staying a little bit longer with me so we can play a little bit. So, yeah. Lee, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good talking to you, John.